In 1854, a British official named John George Taylor was sent into the Iraqi desert to investigate a remote mound. He worked for the East India Company. He was not an archaeologist. He was a bureaucrat with a shovel and an assignment. He spent several days walking around the mound, digging a little here, poking around there, and at the end of it, he sat down and wrote his official report. And in that report, he described the entire visit as, and I am quoting directly, unproductive of any very important results. He even questioned whether it had been worth writing his notes down at all. Then he packed up, left, and went back to his regular job. The mound sat in the desert for another 90 years before anyone took it seriously again. Here is the part that should bother you. That mound was Eridu, the oldest city on earth, the place the Sumerians said kingship first descended from heaven, the first of the 5 cities built before the Great Flood. And a British bureaucrat walked around it for a few days, decided there was nothing interesting, and went home. That is how close we came to never understanding what was buried there. And that story, that exact moment of almost missing it entirely, is actually the perfect way to understand everything that follows. Because the 5 cities the Sumerians described before the flood have been sitting in the Iraqi desert this whole time. Real cities, real locations, real ruins underneath real sand. And for most of modern history, the world either did not know they existed or did not believe they were worth taking seriously. Until the archaeologists who finally dug them up found things inside that nobody had a clean explanation for. This is the story of those 5 cities, what the Sumerians said about them, what the excavations actually found, and why one of those finds, sitting in an excavation report from the 1930s, is still making historians uncomfortable today. Let us go back to Eridu. Because once you understand what was actually inside that mound Taylor dismissed, the rest of this story lands completely differently. In 1946, nearly a century after Taylor's uninspiring visit, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Sippar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd finally began a proper excavation at Tel Abu Shahrain. They focused on the largest mound at the site and started digging down through the layers. And the further down they went, the older everything got. Layer after layer of human occupation, each one sitting on top of the previous one, each one slightly older than the last. When they finally reached the bottom and hit virgin soil, they counted what they had passed through. 18 successive temples, each one built directly on top of the ruins of the one before it, stretching back to around 5,400 before Christ. Let that land for a second. For over 1,000 years, generation after generation of people came back to this exact spot and rebuilt their temple on the same ground, not nearby, not 100 meters over where the ground was cleaner, the same ground. Whatever was sacred about this location, it was sacred enough that nobody in 1,000 years ever considered moving it. The oldest temple at the very bottom was barely a single room, a small mud brick shrine beside a freshwater spring at the edge of the ancient marshland. Modest, simple, but it was there. The oldest religious structure ever found in Mesopotamia, sitting exactly where the Sumerians said the first city on earth would be, and John George Taylor called it unproductive of any very important results. Now here is the detail about Eridu that most people skip over because it does not fit the standard disaster narrative. Eridu was not destroyed. No army burned it. No conqueror came and razed it to the ground. What happened to the first city on earth is actually much stranger than that. It was abandoned, quietly. Over centuries, the population declined. The canals silted up. The freshwater spring that had made this ground sacred for over 1,000 years dried out as the rivers changed course. And the people just stopped coming. The last inhabitants walked away. The desert moved in. And the city, the Sumerians said, began everything compressed itself into a mound of sand that a British official would one day describe as not worth writing about. The Sumerian tablet says Eridu fell and the kingship was carried to the next city. The archaeology says exactly the same thing, just without the drama. The second city is Bad-tibira. The name means fortress of the copper workers, which tells you immediately what this place was built around. Industry, craft, people who took raw material out of the ground and transformed it into something the ancient world needed. 3 kings ruled Bad-tibira according to the record, and one of them is a name that stops you when you see it. Dumuzid, who is not just a king in the Sumerian record. Dumuzid is a god, the divine husband of En-men-dur-ana, the deity of spring and the fertility of the earth. And he appears right there in the middle of a list of historical rulers, as if that is completely normal. The Sumerians did not explain the contradiction, because for them, it was not a contradiction. The boundary between gods and rulers in the pre-flood world was apparently not the same boundary we assume today. Bad-tibira has been located but barely excavated, which means whatever is inside it is still inside it. And given what the other pre-flood cities have produced when properly dug up, that is either very exciting or very unsettling, depending on your disposition. The third city is Larak. 1 king, 1 reign. The tablet gives it less space than any of the others. En-men-dur-ana ruled his allotted span, and then the city fell. Larak has been tentatively identified with a site in southern Iraq, but almost nothing has been excavated there. It sits in the desert right now, with most of what it contains still underground. And that is honestly fine, because the cities that have been properly excavated have already given us more than enough to work with. The 4th city is Sippar, and Sippar is where this story picks up a layer that completely changes the stakes. Sippar was the city of Shamash, the sun god, god of justice and divine law. Its great temple, the Ababar, was one of the most important sacred sites in the entire ancient Near East. The city has been excavated, and what came out of it was extraordinary. Thousands of cuneiform tablets, legal records, administrative documents, astronomical observations, evidence of a society that was organized, literate, and functioning at a high level. But what the Sumerian record adds to Sippar is something no excavation can physically confirm or deny. The king of Sippar before the flood was En-men-dur-ana, and scholars who have studied the broader ancient Near Eastern tradition identify En-men-dur-ana as the direct Sumerian predecessor of the biblical Enoch, the man who walked with God and was taken by God and did not die. In the Sumerian account, En-men-dur-ana was the king who was brought into the presence of the gods themselves and given knowledge that was not intended for ordinary human beings, the reading of divine signs, the secrets of heaven and earth. He received it, returned, and passed it down through the priestly traditions of Mesopotamia, through scribal schools, through generations of copyists who preserved texts they may not have fully understood, because they had been told the texts were important. The knowledge that entered the human record through Sippar did not disappear when Sippar fell. It traveled forward, through Babylon, through the temples of Assyria, through the scribal archives of Nippur, and possibly, if you follow the thread far enough, all the way to the document that started this entire series. Sippar gave something to human civilization that outlasted Sippar itself, and then the kingship moved to the 5th city, the last one, the one the flood actually touched. Shuruppak, the city of the wise, the home of Ubara-Tutu and his son Ziusudra, the place where, according to every version of the flood story the ancient world preserved, the warning came and the vessel was built, and one man survived the end of everything. Shuruppak has been excavated at a site called Tel Farah in south-central Iraq. Multiple teams went in. German excavators in the early 1900s, a University of Pennsylvania team led by Erich Schmidt in the 1920s and 30s, and Schmidt found something in the soil of Shuruppak that his excavation report describes carefully, professionally, without any of the drama that the finding actually deserved. A flood deposit, a distinct layer of water-carried sediment sitting between the older occupation levels of the city and the newer ones, thick enough to be measurable, clean enough to be unmistakably water deposited rather than wind deposited, dating to around 2900 before Christ, sitting in exactly the position the tablet implies the flood should have occurred. Below the deposit, the pottery looks one way. Above it, the pottery looks different. The architecture changes. The material culture on either side of that band of sediment does not quite match, as if the people who came back to Shuruppak after the water receded were not working from the same foundation as the people who had been there before. Schmidt wrote about it the way a careful professional writes about something he cannot fully explain. He noted it, documented it, included it in his report, and moved on. But the deposit did not move on. It is still there in the archaeological record. The physical fingerprint of the event that CBS 10673 describes as the end of the pre-flood world. In the city, the tablet says the flood destroyed, found by excavators who were not looking for proof of an ancient text. They were just digging, and the ground gave them this anyway. So here is where you land when you put all 5 cities together. Eridu, found and excavated, 18 temple layers going back to 5400 before Christ. Abandoned without conquest. Oldest religious structure in Mesopotamia, sitting exactly where the Sumerians said the first city would be. Bad-tibira, located but barely touched, sitting in the desert with its contents intact. Larak, tentatively identified, minimally disturbed. Sippar, excavated, thousands of tablets, the home of the king who received divine knowledge and carried it forward through human history. And Shuruppak, excavated, 3 habitation levels confirmed, a flood sediment layer in exactly the right place, dating to exactly the right period, separating exactly the right strata, 5 cities, 5 real locations, 5 separate bodies of archaeological evidence, and a tablet that described all 5 of them 4,000 years ago before anyone with a shovel had set foot near any of them. The standard explanation is that the Sumerians built a mythological framework around real places after the fact, that the flood deposit at Shuruppak was a local flooding event that later traditions inflated into something much larger. Those explanations are possible. But here is what bothers me. A myth does not usually get the cities right. A myth does not usually put the flood sediment in the correct city in the correct stratigraphic position. A myth is not usually confirmed by 90 years of separate archaeological expeditions that were not trying to confirm it. The cities are real. The sediment is real. The sequence is consistent. And John George Taylor almost missed all of it because he spent a few days walking around a sand mound in 1854 and decided there was nothing worth writing down. If this is the kind of history that makes you want to keep digging, subscribe and stay close, because the next video goes into what was actually built inside these cities before the water came, and some of what the excavations found does not fit the official timeline at all.